auspicious start than last time. Well, the inspiration for my talk came when I got this letter in the mail here about 3 weeks ago or something. If anybody's ever seen one of these things, it's a jury summons. Lissa knows all about juries. And I have a little experience too. And so that gave rise to my idea to talk about this subject. And we're going to talk about the power of the jury. Here we have a jury, a nice politically correct jury, too, I might add. The power of the jury. And if you've never, how many people have ever served on a jury? Raise your hand. 2. So most of you haven't. Okay. One of the things that they tell you when you go to jury orientation is that I'm not sure about Oregon actually, I'm not sure about the Oregon, but I know they do in California. Jurors can judge the facts, but must accept the law the judge instructs. And that's a frequently included jury instruction too. But is it true? But is it true? Magna Carta, does everybody know what the Magna Carta was? In June 1215, a bunch of English noblemen took the King of England, King John, at the point of a sword at Runnymede, and they sat him down at that table there, and they made him sign what's called the Magna Carta. I believe it means a great charter, guaranteeing certain rights, and one of those rights was the right to lawful judgment of his peers. Of course, they weren't talking about the common man, they were talking about the nobles. But that's the beginning of the right of trial by jury, at least in English-speaking countries. The trial of William Penn. How many people know about the trial of William Penn? Nobody knows about the trial of William Penn? They didn't teach you that in school? William Penn, you know who William Penn was? William Penn was the founder of Pennsylvania. But before he was the founder of Pennsylvania, he was an Englishman and a Quaker. And the Quakers were a persecuted minority in England at that time. And in England they had a law, and it was called the Conventicle Act. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And it forbade the religious assembly of more than 5 people outside the Church of England. And I'm told that they also even shuttered up some of the other churches, and that William Penn was a Quaker minister and he wasn't allowed to preach in his own church. And the punishment for violating that act was death. Now that, for an unlawful assembly, the punishment was death. But William Penn was a pretty courageous guy, so he stood outside the church and he was preaching outside the church, and he was arrested and charged under the Conventicle Act. And the judge, at that time, there were several judge magistrates, and they ordered the jury to convict him, and they came back with their first verdict. They came back that he was guilty of speaking in Grace Church Street. Well, that's not good enough. That wasn't good enough to convict him, because they had to say that he was a religious assembly. And the judge ordered them to be locked up overnight without food, water, or heat. And apparently that might have made the jury mad. So they came back with a different verdict. They came back with not guilty. And because it was not guilty, William Penn was not put to death. And the court responded by fining all the jurors. 8 of them paid the fine, but 4 jurors spent 9 weeks in prison, often without food and water. And they were finally released under a writ of habeas corpus. And that really that established the English common law right of what's some people call jury nullification. In other words, that the jury can disregard because he broke the law, but the law was bad. Trial of Peter Zinger. Have everybody heard of the trial of Peter Zinger? Peter Zinger, at one time in New York, there was only one newspaper, 1735 in that era. And Peter Zinger established a second newspaper, and the purpose of the paper was to be in opposition to the English governor at that time, who was, by all reports, a pretty nasty character. And they responded by charging him with seditious libels, publishing in the paper, and they arrested him. And here's what the chief judge told the jury. The jury may find that Zinger printed and published those papers and leave to the court to judge whether they are libelous. So they could only decide whether he published the papers. And at that time, under the law, the state of the law at that time, truth wasn't a defense. So even if he violated the law, he said something bad about the government, he was guilty. So, but in that case, the jury disregarded the chief judge's instructions and returned a not guilty verdict. That helped establish the right of a free press in this country. Aren't I doing much better with the machine tonight? The Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights was so important after the Constitutional Convention that they couldn't get it ratified unless they included a Bill of Rights. And in the Bill of Rights, Amendment 6, it says the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury of the state. That's how important the Founding Fathers knew. And the Founding Fathers knew about this history. They knew about Peter Zinger, and they knew about William Penn. Here's how I view it. We have a system of checks and balances, and here's some of the checks and balances that are enshrined in the Constitution. Treaties. President can make treaties, but only with the advice and consent of Senate. And that's relevant right now. Our current president's making a treaty with Iran, but yet he's not calling it a treaty to subvert the Constitution. Congress can override a presidential veto with 2/3 majority. Senate approves presidential appointments. Congress can impeach judges. These are all checks. And the last check is the jurors are a check on all other branches of government. So some people call the press the fourth branch of government, but I think really you could call the jury the fourth branch of government. Got to speed up again because defense attorneys are prohibited from informing jurors about nullification in the courtroom. Isn't that interesting? The only Supreme Court justice ever impeached was charged with denying the rights of jurors to judge the law. Isn't that interesting? This is the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals in a 1972 case said this. That's the second highest court in the land. The jury has an unreviewable and irreversible power to acquit in disregard of the instructions on the law given by the trial judge. I'm going to have to speed up. Does anybody know about it's called the Bloodhound Law. It was the Fugitive Slave Act. Before the Civil War, it was a crime to help slaves. And people that did were faced a 6-month imprisonment and $1,000 fine. But juries en masse refused to acquit by exercising their power to nullify an unjust law. I'm going to speed up here. Here's some recent trials. I won't get into it. You can research it. But what's the conclusion? What's the takeaway from all this? If jurors have the power to judge the law and the facts, then why do the courts now, to this day, tell jurors that they don't have that power or right? Thank you.